Hi, I'm Scott Alexander, and I'm going to do a voiceover recording on screen. This is something I haven't done before, of my new essay, Maimonides Guide of the Perplexed. That's Morei Nevukhim, Chapter 210. Some prefer to learn this way. I don't use conventional footnotes. However, in a reduced font, in parentheses, I do insert references at appropriate places. Since you'll be able to see it on the screen and you have the ability to pause the playback, for the most part, I'll skip over reading those references. For most of my content, there's a large series of videos and voiceovers on my YouTube channel, and all of this material, together with all of my chapter essays, and other videos and podcasts, links, and associated essays and other materials are at Maimonides-guide.com. All of this material is copyrighted 2025. Scott Alexander, no usage without express permission. If you like what you see, like, subscribe, and push the notification buttons for this channel. You'll find a copy of this essay and perhaps other documents in YouTube's notification section beneath this video. Okay, let's start. Maimonides Guide of the Perplexed, Chapter 210, Maimonides' Revelation of Our Tetradic Universe. This is my essay explaining Chapter 210. If you want to read Chapter 210 in the original, there are various links. I'll try and put them under the YouTube video, and you can see them there. When I cite anything from the chapter in the guide, and I do it without indicating whose translation it is, that will usually be Friedlander. If it's Hebrew, it'll always be Rabbi Kafih. Okay, Maimonides' revelation of our tetradic universe. Overview, Maimonides' prophetic moment. Maimonides had a strange and extraordinary vision. At the end of the last chapter, Maimonides wrote that he would, in Guide 210, reveal what he called his near-prophetic illumination. He saw that the forces governing our universe come in patterns of four, meaning that the universe has an innate tetradic, that is to say, fourness or fourfold character. He wants us to know about his vision without being explicit. Indeed, he left several hints in several other chapters. This tetradic revelation came to him while he meditated on obscure allusions in rabbinic and philosophic texts about nature. He said in Guide 2.9, the previous chapter, in the Pinnis translation, I shall first set forth for your benefit a preface needed for the purpose I have in view in this chapter, in 2.9, the previous chapter. This number 4 is for me a very important basis for a notion that has occurred to me and that I have not seen explicitly stated by any philosopher. I found, however, in the dicta of the philosophers and the discourse of the sages, indications that drew my attention to it. I shall accordingly mention them and explain the notion in the following chapter. Guide 2.9 was the chapter where Maimonides reorganized astronomy into four superspheres that moved the heavens. This notion of a tetradic universe was the purpose of that chapter. In chapter 322, volume 3, chapter 22, he tells us more about his near-prophetic vision. He uses the phrase ke'ein chazon. The prophet Zechariah had spoken of four chariots and the four heavenly winds that present themselves, mehit yatsev, to the Lord in Zechariah 6, chapter 6. Maimonides connected them with Job's four angelic sons of God that also present themselves, lehit yatsev, before the Lord in Job chapter 1 and chapter 2. The key was the recurring number 4. It unlocked his astonishing breakthrough. He writes, understand this notion and consider how extraordinary it is. and see how these notions came to me through something similar to a prophetic revelation. Maimonides came to discuss those 4 winds, 4 chariots, and 4 angels in our chapter 2:10. He connected his 4 superspheres to the 4 sublunar elements, fire, air, water, and earth, and to the 4 forces that the superspheres emanate upon those elements. Still, he shrank from describing his vision. In consequence, he writes in 2:10, in the Pinnis translation on his page 270, in consequence, when I knew this, that is to say, about the connection of the superspheres to the elements, it occurred to me that each sphere is also specially assigned to one of the 4 elements, the sphere being the principle from which the forces of that particular element exclusively derive, and that in virtue of its motion causes the element to move in the motion of generation. About 2/3 of the way through our chapter, he began to unveil the wonder of his vision, writing, "This number 4 is marvelous and worthy of reflection." Grasping the nature of the universe and our part in it is crucial for the training of prophets and for our own insight. That it struck him as a vision is itself a key unlocking the prophetic core of the guide. There's a large note that follows this. I'll skip this now, but you probably should look at it because it has an interesting discussion of Abraham Joshua Heschel's article, Did Maimonides Believe That He Had Attained Prophecy? The next section is titled Providential Pervasiveness. By the way, if this is set up a little bit differently than in my printed essay, I can't help it. That's something the computer is doing in reformatting it for the screen. External causation. Divine providence reaches all creatures. The philosophers thought providence was limited to species or universals, but not to individuals. Maimonides, however, saw that it extends to every living being created by God. The philosophers were correct, however, in thinking that our world could not itself be the source of this providence. But where does it come from? Maimonides wrote at the beginning of our chapter, "It is a well-known fact that the philosophers, when they discuss in their works the order of the universe, assume that the existing order of things in this sublunary world of transient beings depends on forces which emanate from the spheres." The philosopher's point was that the source of providence must be external to our earth. That was because nothing causes itself. Nihil est causa sui. As Maimonides explained in his Aristotelian proposition number 18, everything that passes from potentiality to actuality has a separate external change agent. Bernard Woolner, in the Dictionary of Scholastic Philosophy, wrote, "Every contingent being, that is to say, every created being, requires a cause distinct from itself to explain its existence. Put differently, an effect has nothing that its cause did not grant." Maimonides concluded in Guide 172, "The sphere sends to every being the forces that are in it." The idea is biblical. God had admonished Job that the divine rule comes from the heavens. In Job, it is written in chapter 38, "Canst thou bind the sweet influences of the Pleiades, or loose the bands of Orion? Canst thou bring forth Matzrot," constellations or zodiacal signs, "in its season, or canst thou guide Arcturus with his sons? Knowest now the ordinances of heaven? Canst thou set the dominion thereof in the earth?" The Hebrew there is im tasim mishtaro be'aretz, which literally means, "Does your writ run the world?" The point over here is we're talking about particular providence. The Midrash responded to these ideas, saying, There is not a single blade of grass that does not have a mazal, that is to say, a star or a constellation, it could mean either of those, in the firmament that strikes it and says to it, grow. Was this proclamation of individual star-driven providence justified by the science that the philosophers and the rabbis both seemed to accept? After all, saying that external forces run our world is not the same as saying that providence assigned to a star to each individual blade of grass. Does the divine providential apparatus affect individuals or only species? Was the outrageous claim of the Midrash well-founded? What brought the rabbis to this concept of pervasive providence? Maimonides suggests the answer. Two specific stars change things on earth. Those forces are evident to all, justifying the blade of grass midrash. They are the sun and the moon. It seemed clear to Maimonides, although in fact it isn't that clear, it's not even true, that the moon's waxing increases the volume of the seas, while its waning causes their diminution. But he was on firmer ground when he wrote that the moon's waxing and waning had something to do with the rise and fall of the tides. Similarly, the elevation of the sun increases warmth while its setting cools. The superspheres of the sun and the moon both therefore change the individual things in our world. They do this because the moon emanates its force on the element of water, while the sun affects the element of fire. Even philosophers accepted this evidence. It inspired Maimonides' Tetradic revelation. He writes, in the Pinnis translation, "In consequence, when I knew this, it occurred to me that while the four spheres having stars, the superspheres, have forces that overflow," he means to say emanate, "from them as a whole toward all the things subject to generation, these spheres being the causes of the latter, each sphere is also specially assigned to one of the four elements, the sphere being the principle from which the forces of that particular element exclusively derive, and that, in virtue of its motion, causes the element to move in the motion of generation. Each supersphere, therefore, rules one element. Maimonides derived from the cases of the sun and the moon that, number one, the supersphere of the sun governs the element of fire. The supersphere of the five wandering planets, which are Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, governs the element of air. The supersphere of the moon governs the element of water. And the supersphere of the fixed stars governs the earth element. He explained that the supersphere of the five wandering planets governs the air element because the irregularity of the motions and retrogressions of those five planets, see the last chapter, manifests itself in the infinite variability of the winds and breezes on Earth. This theory seems to be Maimonides' innovation. Regarding the earth element, just as the fixed stars move so slowly, that same slowness is manifest in the element of earth, the slowest and most recalcitrant to change of the four elements. Those stars are slow since each constellation takes 2,160 years to move from its current zodiacal house. The sphere of the fixed stars moves the earth element. Perhaps the earth is so sluggish in moving to receive the action being brought to bear upon it, as well as in undergoing combinations because of the slowness of the fixed stars in their motion. The sages gave an indication of the fixed stars being specially assigned to the earth in their saying that the number of the species of plants is the same as the number of the individual stars belonging to the totality of the stars. This influence of the stars on the earth justifies the blade of grass midrash. The grasses sprout from the soil of the earth element. Since the number of plants and the number of fixed stars is uncountable, it seemed reasonable to assume that one of those myriad stars governed a single one of the innumerable vegetables. Maimonides expresses no doubt that this idea was consistent with and justified by the accepted scientific paradigm. Not only were the rabbis justified in saying that the emanations of a particular star govern a single blade of grass, but that this providential regime extended to everything, and he wrote, "They have thus clearly expressed it, that even each individual being in this world has its corresponding star. Ishi ha'avaya yesh lehem kochot kochavim miyuchadim lehem." Rabbi Aphodi's objection. Rabbi Aphodi rejected the literal interpretation of this last statement by Maimonides. By saying each generated individual, Ishi ha'havaya, Maimonides meant the generated species, Mine ha'havaya. But Rabbi Aphodi was wrong. His tendentious reading, which misled many, would make Maimonides more Aristotelian than he actually was. Worse, it would make his God the God of the philosophers rather than the God of Judaism, a God who does not affect his individual creatures. Maimonides might have asked those for whom providence extended only to species what God demanded of Job. "Dost thou know the laws of heaven? Does your writ run the world?" Just for your information, there's some information about who Rabbi Aphodi was in the reference. Maimonidean organicism. This whole trend of thought in these passages is to recognize the pervasiveness of divine providence in each creature. Maimonides confirmed this with his organicism doctrine, announced in Guide 172, although he doesn't actually use the word organicism. Though this providential pervasiveness touches every individual being, the whole still functions as one organic body. Although, he writes, although the influences of the spheres extend over all beings, there is besides the influence of a particular star directed to each particular species, a fact noticed also in reference to the several forces in one organic body, for the whole universe is like one organic body, as we have stated above. In the reference note, I pick up that Rabbi Pinnis translates that last phrase, as is the case with regard to the forces of a single body, inasmuch as all that exists is, as we have mentioned, a single individual. Where Friedlander uses the word organic, Pinnis uses the word individual. Both are correct. Rabbi Friedlander is emphasizing organicism, while Pinnis emphasizes individuality. Every individual creature is a unit. You can think of this like any military division is called a unit. Rabbi Evan Shmuel explained in his commentary, which I've translated here, every individual body, every Geshem Echad, is composed of many forces, but has one general force in it that makes it one individual unit, Lechativa. Though each organ in it has its own specific force, like the power of sight or the power of hearing, a single general emanation bestows many forces. The emanation from the spheres is a general emanation, just as sunlight or electricity is a general force. Each sphere's single emanated force powers many entities. Maimonides explained why this point is necessary. He wrote in chapters 53 and 72, "For the whole universe is like one organic body." In other words, just as you are one whole being with many functions, the universe is also, and so is each force that emanates from each heavenly body in that universe. From one thing, only one thing comes. This answers a question that had troubled religious thinkers. If God is one and simple, i.e., non-composite, how do the many come from the one? What is the relation of the single simple divine power to its universe of creations? Maimonides states the question in Guide 222, quoting from a paraphrase of Aristotle. The issue arose because, he writes, Aristotle and all philosophers assume as an axiom that a simple element can only produce one simple thing, while a compound can produce as many things as it contains simple elements. In accordance with this axiom, Aristotle holds that the direct emanation from God must be one simple intelligence and nothing else. Although Maimonides is actually drawing on Avicennan ideas rather than Aristotle's, the question remains whether anything other than what is one and simple can come from something that is one and simple. I point out in the reference well below this that is the title of a major article on this subject. Maimonides' solution was to agree that from one thing only one thing comes, but that the universe is just that one thing. He writes, "Know that this universe in its entirety is nothing else but one individual being. God creates one organic universe with interconnected parts. One of those parts is man, but each person is also an organically interconnected unit. Each person's microcosm corresponds to the macrocosm of the universe, just as the universe corresponds to its maker. Creation is the act of the one creating the single universe, which Maimonides viewed as a single sentient being. This one universe holds all its variety, and I should say all of its past and future variety, in its single organic whole. Compare this idea to Leibniz's monad. The miracle of pervasive yet particular providence. Thus, when Maimonides wrote in our chapter, although the influences of the spheres extend over all beings, there is, besides the influence of a particular star directed to each particular species, really each particular kind, a fact noticed also in reference to the several forces in one organic body, for the whole universe is like one organic body." This was his vision of divine providential rule. The heavenly body radiates its emanation, which is a general causative force, on every individual creation and all its parts. Moreover, he writes, each sphere is also specially assigned to one of the four elements, the sphere being the principle from which the forces of that particular element exclusively derive, and that in virtue of its motion causes the element to move in the motion of generation, tenuat hahavaya. Thus, in addition to the grand general emanation from the heavens, each supersphere governs a particular element. The sphere actualizes and causes the element to exist and to move. It also causes its regeneration in each compound and mixture on earth. Divine providence is pervasive, yet remains particular. In Guide 172, he marveled at God's being perfectly transcendent, yet perfectly immanent. How he rules the universe, while his providence extends to all parts, is a complete mystery, which elicits an outburst of feeling. May he whose perfection has dazzled us be glorified. The name for this miracle of pervasive yet particular providence in the history of Jewish esotericism is Maisa Merkava, the account of the the account of the chariot. I have a long note here in which I discuss that phrase I just quoted. I discuss Arthur Hyman's article about what is one and simple, only what is one and simple can come to be. I have a little discussion of organicism and also of the source in Jewish thinking of organicism, which is Rabbi Yosef ibn Tzaddik and his relationship to Rambam. The vision of universal fourness. Having come this far, Maimonides revealed more tetrads, that is, more four-like things, essential to his vision of the universe's design. The arrangement of the universe may therefore be assumed to be as follows. There are four spheres, four elements set in motion by them, and also four principal properties whose earthly beings derive from them, as has been stated above. Furthermore, there are also four causes of the motion of every sphere, namely the following four essential elements in the sphere. Number one, its spherical shape. Number two, its soul. Number three, its intellect. And number four, by its intellect, by which the sphere is capable of forming ideas. And finally, number four, the intelligence which the spheres desire to imitate. Note this well, haven ze hetav. These are the four causes of motion of the spheres. The following are the four principal forces that directly derive then from the spheres. The nature of minerals, the properties particular to plants, the animal faculties, and the intellect. An examination of these forces shows that they have two functions, namely to produce things and to perpetuate them. That is to say, to preserve species or kinds perpetually and individuals in each species for a certain time. I'm calling this last part the 2x2 forces. Perhaps a chart of what Rabbi Narvoni called this 4x4 system would be helpful, and I've got that on the screen right now. You'll see these are the natural tetrads, which I'm calling the 4x4 system after something that Rabbi Narboni wrote. First, the superspheres, which are the fixed stars, the wandering stars, the sun and the moon. Then the elements, you know them. The causes of spherical motion are soul, mind, separate intellect, and sphericality. And then the actions they produce, which are combinative, vegetative, animative, and sapient. And then they manifest themselves in the 2x2 system, which is the kinds of things and the individuals. And each of those, it shows manifest in the generation and the preservation of kinds, and then the generation and preservation of individuals. In the prior chapter, we examined the first tetrad, the superspheres. In our chapter essay on Introduction to Volume 2 of the guide, we talked about the second tetrad, the elements, which are the four elements, and we did that in propositions 17 and 25. And we will discuss the third and fourth tetrads now. When Maimonides wrote, "Note this well, haven ze hetav," he made one of his indications of important esoteric content. He concealed the fullness of his vision due to the prohibition of public teaching of the Maisa Merkava. The word "this" in "note this well," this is a key word. I read this to mean the pervasiveness of the divine design, which weaves together corporeal and incorporeal forces, including one power that he hasn't yet mentioned, our own transcendent mind. As to this rule about the public teaching, see my commentator's preface and the second Mishnah in Hagiga. The third tetrad are the four causes of the motion of the spheres. He wrote, just to remind you, furthermore, there are four causes of the motion of every sphere, namely the following four essential elements in the sphere: its spherical shape, its soul, its intellect by which the sphere is capable of forming ideas, and the intelligence which the sphere desires to imitate. These are the four causes of the motion of the spheres. The four causes of the motion of any sphere form Maimonides' third tetrad. They are, number one, the sphere's sphericality. Number two, the soul of the sphere, which is responsible for its motion. In the Maimonidean and Aristotelian view, what makes something move, anything move, which is alive, is its soul. And then you have the intellect or the mind of the sphere. I underline of the sphere. It is always with the sphere. It can think of higher entities, including the separate intellect, which rules the sphere. And then the fourth thing that's making it move is that transcendent separate intellect, which rules the sphere. It follows from all of this that the sphere has two intellects. The first is the sphere's immanent intellect. It remains with the sphere's physical body, just as our mind stays with us wherever we go. The second intellect, the separate intellect, is entirely different from and apart from the sphere. We call it separate since it has no connection with anything physical whatsoever. The sphere must have, number one, a spherical body, and number two, a soul, to keep it in continuous rotation. He wrote, "The explanation is this: the sphere could not have been continuously in motion had it not this particular form. Continuity of motion is only possible when the motion is circular. Rectilinear motion, even if frequently repeated in the same motion, in the same moment, cannot be continuous, for when a body moves successively in two opposite directions, it must pass through a moment of rest. The necessity of a continuous motion continually repeated in the same path implies the necessity of a circular form. The spheres must also have a soul, for only animate beings, bale nefesh, move freely." Maimonides explained that the animate beings move because they have what he called a soul. The sphere must also have a particular shape. Just as a cartwheel has to be round rather than square if the cart is going to move, so the sphere must be spherical to move in continuous, unbroken motion. Those spheres are physical. Since they only move in rotation, however, their physicality is unique. Unlike the spheres, the element's motion is straight up and down, always returning to their proper places. If you look at this second little picture here, I've got it shown that the fire and the air go up and the water and the earth go down. The elements only go up or down, and they always want to get back to where they came from. Thus, the band of fire surmounts the air, which is over the water, below which is the band of the earth, of the earth element. Because their motion is straight line motion, and since there can be no infinite line, it can only continue if it halts and returns at some point. Things go up and down repeatedly, yes, but not uninterruptedly. And that's based on an idea of Aristotle's that there is no such thing as an infinite line. And you can read about that and what I think about that proposition in Maimonides' Aristotelian Propositions 1, 2, and 3 at the beginning of Volume 2 of the guide in the introduction to Volume 2. But in my upper picture, I show how the spheres are always going around, and each sphere is going around, and they're all rotating. That's all they do. Rectilinear motion produces no mixtures. For the four elements to combine as they do in nature, they must swerve into each other. This can only happen with the advent of rotatory motion from the spheres. The matter of the sphere is therefore different from the four elements. It's composed of something different. It's the heavenly fifth element. That's what we call the quintessence, fifth element, which has only two qualities that we know about, which are transparency and rotatory motion. Its rotation keeps it in eternal, uninterrupted motion. But why is the sphere moving? Although the sphere has a soul as its mover and it's spherical, it still needs to have a reason to move. The reason is its desire for its separate intellect. Maimonides described this desire for the second intellect. He wrote, "There must indubitably be something inciting to motion, namely a conceiving and a desire for that which has been conceived, as we have mentioned. This can only come about through an intellect, which is what we're calling the separate intellect. Thus, there must indubitably be a certain being of which a conception is made and for which there is a desire, as we have explained. The first of the sphere's two intellects is always with the physical sphere, though not in it. The sphere's innate intellect can recognize the separate perfect intellect, love it, and conceive a desire inciting to motion toward it. The problem is that the separate intellect does not exist on the plane of physical motion. Being incorporeal, it is not on the space-time motion continuum. The sphere cannot move toward its desire. It is impossible. Since the sphere cannot approach the separate intellect, it does the next best thing. It imitates the separate intellect's perfection by moving in perfect eternal rotation. Rotation is the perfect motion because only rotation can be uninterrupted and eternal. It is the closest approach the sphere can make to the perfection of the separate intellect. This, then, is the third tetrad, the four causes that explain why the sphere moves. Number one, its sphericality. Number two, its soul. Number three, its immanent mind. And number four, its separate intellect. Len Goodman, the new translator of the guide into English directly from Arabic, explained that these are respectively the four Aristotelian causes of its motion. Number one, its material cause. Number two, its effective cause. Number three, its formal cause. And number five, its final cause or purpose. You'll find that on page 86 in his new translation. The fourth tetrad are the four actions of the spheres in our world. Each of the four superspheres governs one of the four elements and integrates it in our world. These are thus four causes of the motion of the sphere and four sorts of general forces proceeding from it, emanating from it, toward us. These are, as we have explained, the force causing the generation of animals, the force of the vegetative soul, the force of the animal soul, and the force of the rational soul. How does this work? Initially, the superspheres broadcast a general force. This formative power can configure the as yet undifferentiated hylic matter, which has only a potentiality of existence. When this first but still conceptual configuration occurs, it is what medieval scholasticism called corporeal form, forma corporitatis, or tsura gashmit in Hebrew. That emanation, together with the general swerve provided by the rotation of the spheres, informs matter that is prepared to receive that general signal. Those forces then generate the combinative, vegetative, animating, and sapient forces. Those general forces emanate from the spheres to the elements, blending them and preparing them for their ultimate manifestation in mineral, vegetable, animal, or human form. They are the final triad. The twice-doubled force. These four forms are generated and preserved in our world in their kinds and in the individuals of those kinds by a general formative power that creates and maintains the things of our world. This twice-doubled cycle complements the 4x4 tetradic forces coming from heaven to earth. He writes, now if you consider the activities, you'll find that they are of two species. They cause either the generation of all that is generated or the preservation of what is generated. I mean to say, the preservation of its type or kind in a permanent way, and the preservation of its individuals for a certain duration. The cycle combines creative and providential energies, that is to say, Maisa Merkava and Maisa Bereshit. It brings forth the enduring kinds of things on earth, as well as the perishable individuals of those kinds. The force is, I'm calling it doubled, because it causes and preserves those kinds forever and their individuals for their lifetimes. All creatures, all species depend on this force of nature. Nature, the wonder of the divine decree. Surveying his vision to this point, Maimonides expresses wonder at the intelligence of its design. Understand this well, haven zehetav. These are the four causes of the motion of the spheres, which cause either the generation of all that is generated or the preservation of what is generated. It is the meaning of nature, zehu ha'inyan ha'teva, which is said to be wise, having governance, caring for the bringing into existence of animals, that is to say, animate beings, by means of an art similar to that of a craftsman, meaning really intelligent design, and also caring for their preservation and permanence through the bringing into existence of formative forces which are the cause of the existence of living beings, and also nutritive forces which are the cause of their lasting for whatever duration is possible. What is intended thereby is the divine decree from which these two activities derive through the intermediary of the sphere. When he says this is the meaning of nature, the term this refers to the entire structure we've been talking about, from the divine decree at the top of the system through the angelic intellects whose spheres emanate the formative forces actualizing all of nature's manifestations. Maimonides conveys his astonishment at how divine action is transcendent and immanent, pervasive yet particular, leading him to write that the spectacle dazzled his eyes. This was the notion that we talked about in the beginning that came to him through something similar to prophetic revelation, the revelation of his Merkava vision. But there's one detail he left out. It's still missing, and that's our own human active intellect. The ladder of Jacob. This number 4 is wondrous and should be an object of reflection. They, the rabbis, said in Midrash Tanhuma, how many steps were in Jacob's ladder? 4. The strange and wondrous number 4. The number 4 relates to other numbers in striking ways. 4 is the source of the decimal system because the sum of the first 4 prime digits is 10. But it's also the root of any number. Lagrange's theorem, known from antiquity, states that any natural number is the sum of 4 squares. In ancient times, the Pythagoreans thought that the number 4 evoked the material world, that is, the world of nature and physicality, while 3 represented the spiritual world. I have a picture here, which is an ancient picture. They've messed up the way the label is showing. It's from Nor von Rosenroth, a historical figure who lived in 1684. And it's a picture of what are called the Partsufim, or it's a beginning of a picture of the Partsufim. This is the Partsuf called Seir Anpin. The number 4 appears often in Judaism: the Tetragrammaton, the 4 matriarchs, the 4 species taken on Sukkot, and on Passover we have 4 cups, 4 sons, 4 questions, 4 expressions of redemption. Even though the prophets of the Bible repeatedly emphasize the number 4, and Maimonides has meditated now on it for several chapters, Rabbi Evan Shmuel in his commentary wrote that we have not exhausted its tetradic implications. He presumably meant that just like the 10-based system of the Sephirot, where each Sephira is a molecular formation of another 10 Sephirot, which then get recast in other structures that are called Partsufim, similarly the Maimonidean tetrads might mirror in themselves endless tetradic formations. In my footnote, I discuss a little bit about the Partsufim. I tell you about the Lagrange theorem, about the Pythagoreans. Behold a ladder. Maimonides grasped the number 4 as the key to Jacob's prophetic ladder vision. In Genesis chapter 28, Jacob dreamed, and behold, a ladder set up on the earth. The top of it reached to heaven, and behold, the angels of God ascending and descending on it. Maimonides contemplated the ladder through the prism of Midrash, specifically Midrash Tanhuma, quoting from the manuscript before him. In Midrash Tanhuma, the following passage occurs: How many steps were in Jacob's ladder? 4. This Midrashic reference ties Maimonides' tetradic vision to Jacob's prophetic vision. The ladder is the perfect symbol for the natural order as it descends through the divine emanations in cascades of tetrads. It is the architect of the divinely instituted natural order and of our role in it. Rabbi Yehuda Evan Shmuel called it the ladder of existence, the Sulam HaMetziot. It is the great chain of being. It is the Scala Naturae. This idea resonated through Western thought from its original biblical appearance, coursing through Midrash, Talmud, Plato, Aristotle, Plotinus, and medieval Neoplatonism. But there are problems, and they are philological problems. There's a problem with this picture. Our received version of Tanhuma doesn't state the number of steps in the ladder. Maimonides anticipated difficulties. His text continues. Some read in the above passage how many steps were in the ladder? 7. Some may very well have read that. However, modern editions of Midrash reveal no explicit statement of the number of steps in Jacob's ladder, whether 4, 7, or any other number. Nonetheless, as guide commentators suggested, some texts suggesting a ladder of 4 steps appeared in medieval Jewish libraries. Thus, the Midrashic Kabbalistic Encyclopedia Yalkut Ruveni tells us the secret of the 4 steps that Jacob saw in the ladder were the 4 who entered paradise, entered Pardes. This Yalkut passage, which is a medieval, late medieval, early Renaissance encyclopedia, aligns well with the message of our chapter that meditation on nature's ladder of existence leads the prophetic adept to the revelatory world, just as such contemplation elevated rabbis Akiva, Elisha, Ben Zoma, and Ben Azai to paradise. But the point of the several commentators citing Yalkut was to show that its author counted the steps in the ladder the same way Maimonides did, presumably reading from Maimonides' midrashic source. We know the Maimonides' family library of Tannaitic manuscripts showed variations that no longer appear. But early sources like Yalkut Reuveni support the idea that those variations were real and not imagined. 7 steps. Despite his preference for the idea of 4 steps, Maimonides does not dismiss the idea that the ladder could have 7 steps. The fact that prompted his commentators to take the idea seriously. 7-based systems of organization, that is to say, heptadic systems, are as entrenched in Judaism as tetradic systems. We have 7 planets, 7 days of the week, 7 diatonic tones, 7 sisters of the Pleiades, 7 branches of the menorah, 7 aliyot on Shabbat, and 7 blessings of the married couple, etc., etc. Rabbi Shem Tov ibn Falkera, who lived in the 13th century, assigned the 7 steps to the primary colors of the rainbow: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. He connected this with the 7 heavens of Hagiga 12a, Talmud Hagiga. The Zohar hints that the ladder itself is one of the 7 steps, counting the ladder as the throne of glory, number 2 heaven, number 3 earth, because its base was on the earth, which together with the 4 directions of the heavens, that is to say 2 going up, 2 going down, make 7. The modern exegete Rabbi Evan Shmuel even tried his hand at this, analogizing the 7 levels to the 7 steps of existence in the great chain of being, and I made a picture of it. Number 1, prime matter elements, and then their 4 composite forms. Number 2, the inanimate things. Number 3, plants. Number 4, animals. And number 5, humans, all in the lower world. Above them come the spheres, and above them the intellects. Note that in this version of Rabbi Evan Shmuel, all the levels are still in our universe. Even the minds that he's talking about here, he hasn't specified about the active intellect. The separate intellects are all in our universe. All are natural, none are transcendent. In this, he followed Rabbi Afodi and others like him, whether they counted 4 or 7 levels. But not everyone would interpret this way. Rabbi Narboni rejected the model, arguing that part of the ladder must transcend our world. He was correct, although he didn't articulate it well. Rabbi Evan Shmuel also came to this view. But it's not the number of steps, it's the number of angels. Maimonides shows us the way back to his tetradic system after this detour through the 7 heavens, dissipating the philological fog. Some read, he wrote, in the above passage, how many steps were in the ladder? 7. But all readings and all midrashim unanimously express that the angels whom Jacob saw ascending the ladder and descending were only 4, 2 of whom were going up and 2 coming down. The point was not the number of steps, whether 4 or 7. The real subject, we learn, is the number of angels that ascend and descend the steps. Maimonides claimed rabbinic authority that there were 4 angels, 2 ascending, 2 descending. The Epistle to Rabbi Chazdai Halevi. Jewish tradition related these 4 angels to the 4 elements. The Kabbalist classic Tikkuni Zohar, which is a very early work, teaches that, and behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it, meaning to ascend, wind and fire, which are light, meaning lightweight, and to descend, water and dust, which are heavy. And they are, referring to the archangels, Michael, water, Gabriel, fire, Nuriel, wind, and Raphael, earth. Maimonides in Guide 172 describes the motion of those elements. He says the straight rectilinear motions found in these four elements when they move to return to their place are of two kinds. One motion is toward the encompassing region, i.e. the outer sphere of the universe, which applies to fire and air. The other motion is toward the central point, the center of the earth, which applies to water and earth. Now, does this create an interpretive traffic jam? Does our chapter's physical, metaphysical, divine interpretation of the four angels conflict with Maimonides' argument in Guide 115 that the angels are prophets? Or what he says in Mishneh Torah, where he gives a political explanation that they are the four empires that oppress the Jews, Babylon, Media, Greece, and Edom? The question was raised in Maimonides' lifetime and answered in his attributed epistle to Rabbi Chazdai Halevi. The text expects us to accept various legitimate interpretations and to coordinate them appropriately. It's a little bit long, but if you'll indulge me, he writes, in Maimonides, or the epistle reads, regarding your question about the vision of angels ascending and descending upon the ladder. In Guide 115, we explained it as referring to the prophets, while in Guide 210, our chapter, we explained it as referring to the elements, meaning really the elemental forces. This distinction should not be difficult for you when you see how the complex and the simple come into full view. In our account of the elements, we said the simple elements affect the prophets. For there is no prophet who ascends unless the fire element within him dominates, nor does he descend unless the earth element within him dominates. For by the fire of desire he ascends to grasp knowledge, and by the cold dryness of the earth he descends to rest in what he has grasped, until he ascends again, never more to descend, just as Elijah of blessed memory ascended to heaven in a chariot of fire in the second book of Kings, chapter 2. And as we mentioned when we said in Guide 115, how fortunate is it when they said ascending and descending, for the ascent precedes the descent. We noted how well chosen the words of the parable that the ascending precedes the descending. Our idea was that man is created from the very substance of the earth, and therefore his ascent always precedes his descent, for he begins very low as dust from the ground, quoting Genesis chapter 2. Rabbi Yosef Caspi, another medieval commentator, joined in. This is the intention of Maimonides, that he wants one thing to have many meanings. It is a profound meditation upon his method of interpretation of prophetic parables and the allegories found in the words of the sages. That's my translation. Indeed, this profound meditation, like Maimonides' similarly multivalent approach in the Guide's lexicon chapters, which are generally 1 through 40 of Volume 1, helps diffuse the contradictions beloved of academics. On that bugaboo, see my introduction to contradictions. Rabbi Evan Shmuel justly wrote, since Maimonides concealed its meaning, he freed us to choose the appropriate interpretation from those that he specified in his revealed text. But nothing is that simple. Scholars question the provenance of the epistle. Rav Evan Shmuel accepts its Maimonidean authorship. Even if Maimonides did not directly write it, Professor Zvi Langerman was willing to assign it to the school of Maimonides. Thus, even if Maimonides did not write the letter, it reflected his influence on Jewish thought during the medieval period. In any event, the epistle was an early, reasonable response to the interpretational challenges flowing from Maimonides' multiple interpretations of prophetic symbolism. I brought a few references about who wrote the epistle, and also note that where he talks about the elements affecting the prophets, that might have been the reason why a lot of commentators didn't want to attribute this to Rambam, but it is in Maimonides. In Guide 134, the elements affect educability by way of the four humors, which produces one's complexion of personality, temperament. Also in chapter 40 of volume 2, we learned that the inhabitants of the extreme north and the extreme south are apparently, he's saying, of limited understanding and unable to arrive at a knowledge of God, just because they're not from the centrally located climate of Israel, which distinguishes by wisdom and courage. However you feel about that, that's not my issue. The point I'm making is that he clearly felt that people are influenced by the elements. And if that's true of anyone, it's certainly true of the prophets. The problem of the surplus fraction. These four angels, the two that went up and the two that went down, he writes, occupied one step of the ladder, standing in one line. Hence, it has been inferred that the breadth of the ladder, the width of the ladder, in this vision was 4/3 of the world. For the breadth of an angel in a prophetic vision is equal to 1/3 of the world. Compare, and his body was like Tarshish, as it says in Daniel chapter 10. The four angels therefore occupied 4/3 of the world. The saying of our sages that the angel is a third part of the universe, or in the words of Bereshit Rabbah chapter 10, that the angel is a third part of the world, is quite clear. We have already explained it in our large work on the Holy Law, by which he means Mishneh Torah, Yisodia Torah 2:3. The whole creation consists of three parts. Number one, the pure intelligences, or angels. Number two, the bodies of the spheres. That's that quintessence. And number three, the materia prima, or the bodies which are below the spheres and which are subject to constant change, unlike the spheres which don't change. After hearing these passages for the first time, one of my students brilliantly objected, "How can you have 4/3 of anything?" That's the right question. James Arthur Diamond called it the problem of the surplus fraction. 4 angels in a row. The image that provoked the problem of the surplus fraction is the discovery that the 4 angels ascending and descending the ladder stand at one moment on one step in a row. This conclusion is not explicit in the biblical text. However, Rabbi Barachia in Bereshit Rabbah taught, he, God, showed Jacob the world and a third of the world. Ascent, no less than 2. Descent, no less than 2. Read that together with Talmud Chulin 91b. When they met each other on the ladder, they were 4. This requires explanation. First, Jacob beheld a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven, and behold, the angels of God ascending and descending on it. The word angels, malachi, is in plural, so they could not be less than 2. Since they ascend and descend, all 4 must meet at some point on one step of the ladder. Secondly, question: if the angels are incorporeal, how do they occupy space? The fact that they were standing together led to the thought that they were bodies occupying space. Drawing from a verse in Daniel, The rabbis pondered the angel's size, whatever that may have meant to them, and we don't necessarily have to take them literally. A figure dressed in linen and gold appeared in Daniel's vision, identified by Midrash as the angel Gabriel. Daniel chapter 10 writes, "His body was like Tarshish, his face has the appearance of lightning, his eyes as lamps of fire, his arms and feet like in color to polished brass. Nechoshet klal," know those words. "And the voice of his words like the voice of a multitude." The Talmud explained that the mysterious Tarshish is a measure of distance. And it is written regarding an angel, his body was like Tarshish, and it is learned that Tarshish was 2,000 parasangs, which are Persian miles. It follows, given that there were 4 angels in a row, that if each angel was 2,000 parasangs, the ladder must have been 8,000 parasangs wide. 2 times 4 equals 8. Tarshish. The problem was that nobody recalled what Tarshish was or where it was. Some speculated that it might have been a Phoenician outpost on the Iberian Peninsula called Tartessos, but nobody had actually seen it. Rashi suggested that we should instead translate Tarshish like the appearance of the sea. According to him, Tarshish was not a city, but was instead the sea, as in Jonah 1:3, a ship going to Tarshish, by which Rashi meant a ship going to sea. In his comments on Ezekiel 1:16, Rashi also suggested that it was a precious stone, the color of the sea. Aristotle thought it was a river. Rabbi Yaakov Emden read Tarshish as an Aramaic contraction meaning 2/6, tre shesh, that is to say 2/6, 1/3, linking the idea with Rashi's statement. Tre shesh, he wrote, and this is my translation from Hagahot Yahavetz, Tre shesh is 2,000 from the 6,000 that is the world. Thus, the angel is a third of the world. According to Rashi, Tarshish is the sea, and the sea is a third of the world. But the Midrash above held that each of the angels was a third of the world, and there were 4 angels on a rung, so that what Jacob saw was the world and a third of the world in extent. Maimonides collapsed this speculation, which Goodman rightly called convoluted, in one sentence. It has been inferred that the breadth of the ladder in this vision was 4/3 of the world. For the breadth of an angel in a prophetic vision is equal to 1/3 of the world, and his body was like Tarshish. The 4 angels therefore occupied 4/3 of the world. Now, as far as I could tell, Rambam is the only one that's using the term 4/3. The others say that each is a third of the world, and they'll use the phrase the world and a third of the world. But the actual formulation 4/3, that seems to be Maimonides. This reference to the physical size of the angel could not have pleased him, since it incorrectly suggests that incorporeal forces like angels occupy physical space. He paused for a few sentences to discuss prophecies of Zechariah and Ezekiel, but then returned to clean up the damage. The saying of our sages that the angel is a third part of the universe, or, in the words of Bereshit Rabbah, that the angel is a third part of the world, is quite clear. We've already explained it in our large work on the Holy Law, Mishneh Torah, Yisodei 2:3. The whole creation consists of 3 parts: the intellects, the bodies of the spheres, and the material, the prime matter, the bodies below the spheres, subject to constant change. It comes out that when the rabbis said that the angel is a third part of the universe, they didn't mean that the angel was a third part of the universe's physical space, but that those intellects were one of the three kinds of things in the universe. That conclusion is far more comfortable for Maimonides and fits his physical metaphysical cosmology as well. But he still hadn't said anything about the mysterious fourth third. The surplus fraction explained. The best answer among the several proposals is that the surplus fourth is the active intellect that Maimonides established in the Guide's first chapter as the image of God from Genesis chapter 1. Man is made in the image of God. The Tselem Elohim. And God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness. B'tsalmenu. The active intellect, the Seichel HaPoel, is that transcendent intellectual state that is our special connection to the divine. It is no less real than the other three parts of reality that Maimonides identified in the Mishneh Torah, the intelligences, the spheres, the physical bodies. But we cannot classify the active intellect with those three parts of our universe. Why? It's not one of the separate intellects of the spheres, nor is it one of the angels. The image of God is completely outside of that system. Jacob's ladder, with its four angels that are the 4/3 of the world, reaches beyond our world. It's the path to transcendence. Professor James Diamond called the fourth third the surplus fraction and explained that it must be the active intellect. Guide translator Len Evan Goodman endorsed that solution. While it's not the only interpretation on offer, it is the best, Professor Diamond wrote. This is a long quote also. He wrote, there is still one component missing from the scheme that can be accounted for by the surplus fraction of the world that the Midrashic dimensions reveal. The four angels are the four intellects who govern the four spheres. There remains one intellect who does not preside over the sphere, but funnels all the forces of the superior intellects down into the sublunar realm, the active intellect at the top, because it is responsible for sublunar matter, form, and human rational activity, including prophecy. It is the most relevant for men. The fact that it is, as Davidson characterizes it, an eternal cosmic transmitter, broadcasting an undifferentiated range of forms, like Platonic forms, as well as the substratum that can receive them, the prime matter, renders it the mirror of all being for men. This angel constitutes that extra third, which is the conduit between the higher elusive intellects and ultimately God. In its capacity as the conveyor of thought, form, and governance, by way of being the final outlet for divine overflow to the world of man, it enhances man's ability to glimpse into the divine realm. At the same time, it defines the limits of human thought and maintains the distance required, so that any conceptualization of the deity remains free of anthropomorphic corruption. Our active intellect is nothing like the three elements that divine the universe. No angel can rise as high as Moses or Elijah because the angels remain part of the world. That is the meaning of the latter parable. The universe is a step toward prophetic revelation. The vision of the Merkava. In all the Midrashim, it is mentioned and repeated that there are four camps of angels. In his parables, Zechariah, when describing that there came out four chariots, Merkavot, from between two mountains, and the mountains were mountains of brass, in Zechariah chapter 6, says in interpretation of this, "These are the four airs, ruchot, of the heavens which go forth after representing themselves before the Lord of all the earth. They are accordingly the cause of everything that comes to pass." In regard to his mentioning brass, nechoshet, and likewise the dictum burnished brass, nechoshet klal, which appears in Ezekiel chapter 1, perceive in them a certain equivocality. He means homonymity. That is to say, two words that sound alike but mean something completely different. You shall hear an indication regarding that. Textual weaving. The reader may notice that I separated the account of Jacob's ladder above from the vision of the chariot, making liberal use of ellipses. I did this because the text of the guide weaves this material from one allegory back to the other repeatedly. To clarify these passages, I had to separate them, treating Maimonides' account of the ladder allegory separately from Zechariah's parables about the camps of angels and the four chariots. Maimonides' text, these sentences flow in and out of each other. Thus, Maimonides began by discussing the number of the steps in the ladder, and then changed the subject to the four camps of angels, then returned to the possibility of 7 steps, then returned to the 4 angels on 1 step. Changing the subject again, he came to the brass mountains in Zechariah. He changes course one last time with his explanation that the ladder angels are a third of the world. Now, why did Maimonides weave the text in this confusing manner? One reason was the law that proscribed the public teaching of Maisa Bereshit and Maisa Merkava in Talmud Hagiga. Another reason, more important in my mind, was that he wanted his readers to join him in this meditation. When we ascend this mystic ladder, we must also weave elements together. Only then do we arrive at the source of revelation at the apex, which is our connection to God. Since I argue that the overarching purpose of the guide is the training of prophets, he wants those prophetic adepts to weave this for themselves. They must make these connections on their own. No teacher can do it for them. They can only turn to God for help. I make a note that the primacy of education of prophets by no means negates any of the host of Maimonides' other purposes in the guide, but they all contribute to the main purpose. Maimonides' unique but precise reading of Zechariah's Merkava vision. Before we inspect Zechariah's vision, we should first notice how Maimonides began his discussion of Merkava mysticism. Most such discussions begin and end with the vision of a single Merkava chariot revealed to both Ezekiel and Isaiah. Ezekiel's vision is the most detailed, consuming the entire first chapter of the book of Ezekiel. To our surprise, the term Merkava does not appear in either of those accounts. Instead, Ezekiel recounts a strange vision of first 1 wheel and then 4 wheels. Isaiah's vision in Isaiah chapter 6 has neither wheels nor Merkavas, although it does have a throne which is high and lifted up. His train filled the temple. Daniel's vision in Daniel chapter 7 has the throne and the wheels, but no chariot. I beheld till the thrones were cast down, and the Ancient of Days did sit, whose garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like the pure wool. His throne was like the fiery flame, and his wheels as burning fire. Maimonides' vision did not come from the classic Merkava vision of Ezekiel. Although Ezekiel features the 4 wheels that a chariot requires, Maimonides does not connect Ezekiel's vision to his own Merkava vision. He grounded his vision uniquely in the revelatory field of Zechariah's chariots and metal mountains. Zechariah's vision was the only Merkava vision that explicitly featured a Merkava. We think of a chariot in Ezekiel because of a comment in the apocryphal Wisdom of Ben Sira, what some call Ecclesiasticus, chapter 49, quote, Ezekiel saw a vision and described the different orders of the chariot. This difference is striking, since it's the guide's first serious engagement with Merkava prophecy. Although he comes to explain Ezekiel's vision later at the beginning of Volume 3, it plays no role in Maimonides' own vision. In all of this, Maimonides demonstrates his creativity and independence. Gershom Scholem's 2 comprehensive articles on Merkava vision in his book Kabbalah only mention the source in Ezekiel and the historical developments that flow from it. Moreover, rabbinic tradition read the Zechariah passage in political rather than mystical terms, framing the 4 chariots as the 4 empires that conquered Israel. Let's look at the whole passage in Zechariah. This is chapter 6, verse 1 through 8 of Zechariah. And I turned and lifted up mine eyes and looked, and behold, there came forth 4 chariots out from between 2 mountains, and the mountains were mountains of brass. In the first chariot were red horses, in the second chariot were black horses. In the third chariot white horses, in the fourth chariot grizzled and bay horses. Then I answered and said unto the angel that talked with me, What are these, my Lord? And the angel answered and said unto me, These are the 4 spirits, ruchot, of the heavens, which go forth from standing before the Lord of all the earth. The black horses which are therein go to the north country, the white go forth after them, the grizzled toward the south country. And the bay went forth and sought to go, that they might walk to and fro through the earth. And he said, Get you hence, walk to and fro through the earth. So they walked to and fro through the earth. Then he cried upon me and spake unto me, saying, Behold, these that go unto the north country have quieted my spirit in the north country. As Maimonides knew, rabbinic tradition focused on the horses, their color, their geographical location, when it assigned them to the 4 evil empires. He instead focused on the 5th line. Zechariah questioned God's emissary. What are these, my Lord? And the angel answered, These are the 4 spirits of heaven, which go forth from standing before the Lord of all the earth. The angel provides the interpretation of his own parable. But the angel proffers a parable of spirit winds to clarify a parable of chariots, exchanging one parable for another. But that was all Maimonides needed. Inspired by his vision, his near prophetic vision of the divine tetradic natural order, Maimonides revealed what the 4 chariot winds stand for. He wrote, They are, accordingly, the cause of everything that comes to pass. Kol ma shemitchadash. They are, therefore, the tetradic system of formative forces that we've been learning about. What are the mountains of brass? The 4 chariots emerge from 2 brass mountains, mountains of Nechoshet. These peaks are the form and matter of the universe, according to Rabbi Shem Tov in his early medieval commentary, emanating to us in tetradic cascades. The chariots are God's whirling emissaries that are the cause of everything, according to Maimonides. As we will see, the term Nechoshet is richly elusive. We start by assessing its shininess. In Ezekiel's Merkava vision, the prophet talks about this burnished brass when he described the 4 chayot, the 4 holy animals. And their feet were straight feet, and the soles of their feet were like the sole of a calf's foot, and they sparkled like the color of burnished brass. The words are important. V'notzatzim ki'ein nechoshet klal. They sparkled like burnished brass. Nechoshet brass, klal burnished. Rashi helps to understand these strange words. And they sparkled, nitzotzot. Because of their brilliance, sparks seemed to emanate from them, as in Talmud Yoma, Queen Helene made for the temple in Jerusalem a polished golden candelabrum. When the sun shone, sparks, nitzotzot, would seemingly emanate from it. Notzatzim is étincelant, which in French means gleaming. Nechoshet klal. Klal means clarified and gleaming, mezukak umeir. When we're talking about this Queen Helene and the candelabra, Queen Helene came from Adia Beni, a Persian province on the northern Tigris. She was a famous convert to Judaism. She had donated a spectacular golden candelabrum to the temple that picked up the sun's rays so brightly that people used it to tell when morning blessings should commence. The Ezekiel passage associates brass with radiant reflectivity, notes at Sim. Maimonides explicitly connected brass and brightness in his discussion of the Chayot HaKodesh when he gets to Guide 3.2, Chapter 2 of Volume 3. He writes that they picked up light almost like a mirror. He writes, quote, "The prophet then states that they are transparent. They are like burnished brass, nechoshet klal." And he also adds that they are luminous, bichilot. Compare. Their appearance was like burning coals of fire. There's, to the left here is a picture, again, they've screwed up the labels, of an ancient Etruscan bronze mirror in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The term nechoshet has been defined as brass, copper, or bronze. Man has been making bronze, an alloy of tin and copper, for over 6,000 years. Ancient mirrors were usually burnished bronze. When polished, bronze achieves a good reflective surface. Bronze mirrors were the most receptive to light. Even after the Bronze Age passed into the Iron Age, bronze remained the preferred material for mirrors until advances in metallurgy and glassmaking in the middle of the 12th century. That was when Venetian glassmakers began making mirrors by bonding a tin-mercury mixture to clear panes of glass. Jewish tradition evoked Nechoshet's luster with the terms notzatzim or notzatzot, as well as klal. Nechoshet then stands for receptivity due to its capacity to pick up light. Just because of that receptivity, Nechoshet stands for matter. Maimonides wrote, matter as such is, as you are well aware, always receptive, like receptive to light, receptive and passive. Matter is a potentiality receptive to form. That's what matter is. It's potentiality. As matter, Nechoshet also represents physicality. Matter's receptivity evokes femininity. Matter, femininity, and the imagination. Maimonides connected matter to femininity and form to masculinity. In the introduction to the guide, Maimonides maintained that the entire book of Proverbs is based on the analogy between the married harlot and matter, getting the idea of the married harlot from Proverbs chapter 7, which tells the whole story of the married harlot. If you don't know it, you should look at it. With forms standing for either the husband in the parable or the young man void of understanding who appears in that story. Maimonides says, accordingly, he, Solomon, the author of Proverbs, likens matter, which is the cause of all of these bodily pleasures, to a harlot who is also a married woman. In fact, his entire book, the entire book of Proverbs, is based on this allegory, and we shall explain in various chapters of this treatise his wisdom in likening matter to a married harlot, and we shall explain how he concluded this book of his with a eulogy, I think eulogy is the wrong word, of the woman who is not a harlot, but devotes herself to attending to the welfare of her husband and her household, talking about the Eshet Chayil, the woman of valor. The moral: matter embraces form, but will embrace another form in the future. The book of Proverbs bookends the contrast of the woman of valor at the end of the book, chapter 31 of Proverbs. The married harlot is in chapter 7. She is self-reliant, self-conscious, loyal to her husband, a metaphor for the union to one true form. She represents matter, her husband form, and adheres to him as Israel must adhere to God. The term Nechoshet conveys all of these illusions: matter, physicality, reflectivity, receptivity, and femininity. And as it said in the letter of the Epistle of Chazdei Halevi, you're supposed to, as the prophet, know when to apply which illusion and to apply them cooperatively, intelligently, appropriately. But importantly, the reflective quality of Nechoshet suggests the imagination. The imagination is the repository of reflected images. As such, it is the prophet's tool to translate the ineffable divine word into the imaginative language of men. The imagination equips the prophet to teach the revelation to his public. It also has a negative quality. Maimonides called it our evil inclination, the Yetzer Hara. The imagination's unbridled receptivity as married harlot is the source of corruption and sin. But when the good inclination, the Yetzer HaTov, follows the intellect, it is a woman of valor. He gives a dark hint in our chapter when he writes, "You shall hear an indication regarding this." He had in mind his discussion of prophetic language in Guide 229 and 243. In those passages, he discussed anagrams and other word games that the prophetic imagination uses to bring its message to mankind. In Guide 229, he wrote, starting into the subject, "The prophets employ homonymous terms and use words which are not meant to be understood in their ordinary signification, but are only used because of some other meaning which they admit. For example, a rod of an almond tree, a shaked, because of the words which follow, for I will hasten, which is the same word, shaked, in Jeremiah chapter 1, as will be shown in the chapter on prophecy. According to the same principle, Ezekiel in the account of the divine chariot employs the term hashmal in Ezekiel 1, also regal egel, nechoshet kalal, and similar terms. Zechariah chapter 6 likewise adopts this method, and says, and the mountains were mountains of Nechoshet, and the like. Briefly, the point here is don't read the words for what they say in their commonly accepted translations or understandings. He gives us a lot more detail in Guide 243. Now listen to this. The prophets, however, are also shown things which do not illustrate the object of their vision, but indicated by their name through its etymology or homonymity. Thus, the imaginative faculty forms the image of a thing, the name of which has two meanings, one of which denotes something different from the image. This is likewise a kind of allegory, using the term allegory very broadly. Take, for example, the allegories of Zechariah, referring now to chapter 11 of Zechariah. He takes in a prophetic vision staves to lead the flock, meaning staffs. He calls the one Noam, pleasure, the other Chovelim. He indicates thereby that the nation was first in favor with God, who was their leader and guide, Noam, but later a change took place, Chovelim. They rejected the love of God, and God rejected them, appointing destroyers like Jeroboam, and Manasseh, as their rulers. Accordingly, the word Chovelim has the same meaning, that is to say, destroying, as the root Haval has in Mechablim Karamim, destroying the vineyards, in Song of Songs chapter 2. But the prophet found also in the name Chovelim the indication that the people despised God and God despised them. This is, however, not expressed by the word Chaval, but by a transposition of the letters Chet, Bet, and Lamed. The meaning of despising and rejecting is obtained. Compare, my soul loathed them, and their soul abhorred me, Bachala, which is not the same word as Chaval, in chapter 12 of Zechariah. The prophet had therefore to change the order of the letters in Chaval into that of Bachal, treating the Hebrew letters for B and V as the same, ignoring their pronunciation point in Beit and Veit. In this way, we find very strange things and also mysteries in the words Nechoshet, Klal, Regel, Egel, Hashmal of the Merkava, and in other terms in other passages. After the above explanation, you will see the mysteries in the meaning of these expressions if you examine them thoroughly. The reason I italicized that last line is to make you see that he doesn't ever tell you what Nechoshet, Klal, Regel, Egel, Hashmal mean. But he does tell you what Chaval and Bachal mean and their relationship. Thus, Chaval meant destroying, but could be understood as an anagram of Bachala for the conceptual cluster of despising, rejecting, abhorred, merely by reordering its letters. Now that's your model. Maimonides did not apply his decoder ring to all the parables above, but instead invites us to decrypt them using the model. Nechoshet, which is usually thought of as a metal, brass, can, in the unusual but well-known instance of Ezekiel 16, become Nechushtech, which is the thought cluster, get ready for it, of shame, nakedness, the lower part of the female body, the source of the menstrual flow, or of flow issuing from the woman's body from frequent cohabitation. If you're wondering where I'm getting all this from Art Scroll Yecheskel, Volume 1, page 263, where he cites Targum, Rashi, Radak, and Metzudas David in support of those definitions, which I pretty much copied out of there. Ezekiel and Zechariah called the Jews a harlot for abandoning God and whoring after idol worship. The hint we should draw from Bachala in Zechariah 12 is that in both cases of Bachala and Nechoshet in Ezekiel and in Zechariah, God condemns the Jewish people as abhorrent because they are shameful, like a harlot. Wherefore, O harlot, Zonah, hear the word of the Lord. Thus saith the Lord God, because thy filthiness was poured out. Hishafech nechushtech. And thy nakedness discovered through thy whoredoms with thy lovers and with all the idols of thy abominations, and by the blood of thy children which thou didst give unto them, referring to the Moloch worship, where they gave their children to the fire. And I write as my note, Maimonides does not make the connection between Nechoshet and Nechushtech explicit, but David Bakken took his hint in Maimonides on prophecy from 1991. For the thought cluster of Nechushtech, see Art Scroll Yecheskel. Thus, if we read Nechoshet as the symbol of the imagination, as I explained, then the degradation of the imagination to Nechushtech is an apt symbol of corruption. Rabbi Caspi, another early medieval commentator on the guide living in the same century as Rambam after he passed away, made the point explicit by stating that, in his opinion, Nechoshet comes from chashchata, which does mean corruption. The term Nechoshet is also close to the term for snake, nachash, like the snake in the Garden of Eden. The consonants are nearly the same. You may know the story of how Moshe Rabbeinu fashioned a snake out of brass in order to stop a plague of snakes. The stave of brass in the form of a snake was kept around. King Hezekiah of Yehuda, in his zeal to eliminate idol worship, not only destroyed its shrines, pillars, and groves, but also, quote, he broke in pieces the brazen serpent, the Nachash HaNechoshet, you hear the alliteration, that Moses had made. For unto those days the children of Israel did offer to it as an idol, and it was called Nehushtan. That's from 2 Kings chapter 18. Nehushtan is what is called a hapax legomenon, which is a Greek term meaning a Greek phrase meaning a term, any term, which is used only one time in the Bible. Nehushtan is only used once in the Bible. It is an obvious coupling of snake and brass, Nachash and Nechoshet. Maimonides associates the snake with the imagination's evil inclination explicitly, this evil Yetzer Hara, in chapter 30 of volume 2 and in chapter 22 of volume 3 of the guide. David Bakken, hearing all of this, recognized this as evoking the erotic dimension. In guide chapter 30 of volume 2, Maimonides had written, with regard to the same principle, in regard to the chariot, the Merkava, there occurs the word hashmal, as they have explained, and also regel egel, the foot of a calf, and nechoshet kalal, burnished brass. In the same way, Zechariah says, and the mountains were mountains of Nechoshet. Dr. Bakken understood the hashmal, the regel egel, as overt male euphemisms, and Nechoshet, again, like I've explained, being female. He wrote, we take this as a hint by Maimonides of the sexuality associated with the Maisa Merkava. This negates condemnations reported by Professor Moshe Edel of many early Kabbalists, but by no means all, that Maimonides allegedly failed to recognize the sexual implications of the image of the Merkava. He certainly grasped them, but for obvious reasons chose not to make them explicit. Edel blames in this regard, specifically with quotes, Rabbis Ezra of Gerona, Nachmanides, Yoshua ben Shuaib, Shlomo ben Ibn Adret, Menachem Rekanati, Raavad, Yonah Garani, that's Rabbeinu Yonah, all of whom condemn Maimonides on this issue. I cite an article by Edel written in 1990, but he came back and wrote another article in 2004 where he listed the pro-Maimonidean Kabbalists. Despite all of this, all of this bad stuff about Nechoshet, Rabbi Afodi noted the positive side of Nechoshet, my trans. When we read Mountains of Brass, we discerned their hylic matter was pure, clear, and noble. While we could say that they have a potentiality for corruption, since Nechoshet does derive from Chashchata, they acquire, Yiknu, eternality and incorruptibility from their status as separate incorporeal entities. The term there is Hanivdal. He had in mind the separate intellects, Hasiklim Hanivdalim. In other words, to the extent that they link up with intellect, they are no longer conveying a negative illusion, but a positive one. And that's important. Why? Rabbi Afodi understood that despite the problems of the imagination, that faculty is vital for the process of prophecy. Maimonides wrote, "Prophecy consists in the most perfect development of the imaginative faculty." That's from chapter 36 in volume 2. Even if man perfected, according to Maimonides, even if man perfected his mental and moral faculties, he would not experience prophecy unless those faculties combined, as he said, with the highest natural excellence of the imaginative faculty. It is then, in Rabbi Afodi's words, pure, clear, and noble. Len Evan Goodman includes these multiple illusions of Nechoshet as imagination, writing, "It is the glass catching reason's light, the recipient of all prophecy but that of Moses. But it also bears baser impulses, symbolized by the serpent in the garden." You can find the quote on page 206 of his fine new translation. Mountains of Brass as separate intellects. Rabbi Yehuda Evan Shmuel had a different reading of the brass mountains, emphasizing their mountainous and enduring nature and the fact that there are two of them, coming to completely different conclusions than I've just given you. But you can read these things different ways, and that doesn't make any of them wrong. Exploring Maimonides' gloss that the four chariots, four winds are the causes, they could be wrong if used in an inappropriate context. That's one of the things the prophet is supposed to know. Exploring Maimonides' gloss that the four chariots, four winds are the causes which produce all changes in the universe, Rabbi Evan Shmuel suggests that the two mountains must be the ancient mountains, he means the Hararei Kedem, of chapter 33 in Deuteronomy, Devarim, from Moses' blessing to the tribe of Yosef. At the back of his mind was Rashi's explanation, citing Midrash, that these mountains were prior, Kedem, to all other peaks. This warranted Rabbi Evan Shmuel's, Evan Shmuel, by the way, is a modern commentator from the mid-20th century. This warranted Rabbi Evan Shmuel's reading of the mountains as separate intellects. Why? Because the separate intellects are the prior causes of the superspheres through their actualization of them. They bring them forth. The spheres then emanate everything, justifying Maimonides' writing that they produce all changes in the universe. Again, doing it as agents of God, so to speak. Rabbi Evan Shmuel wrote that the two mountains in the vision portray the separate intellects' duality of perception, by which they cognize both the divine world above them and our world below them, and with that knowledge, they can actualize all the potential things in our world. They have the forms from above, they see the potential below. They actualize that potential. The fact that they are metal mountains tells us of their permanent nature, in that they do not erode like other mountains. It means that the separate intellects always manifest themselves as this duality of perception and actualization. They are therefore the, quote, chosen ministers of God to be the proximate causes of every creation in our lower world. Closing admonition. Maimonides closes our chapter with a ringing admonition. In this manner may those understand the dark sayings of prophets, who desire to understand them, who awake from the sleep of forgetfulness, deliver themselves from the sea of ignorance, and raise themselves upward nearer the higher beings. But those who prefer to swim in the waters of their ignorance and to come down very low, in the words of Deuteronomy 28, need not exert the body or the heart or the mind, which is what he means by heart. They need only cease to move, and they will go down to what is lowest in nature. Note and consider well all we have said. Maimonides demands that we pursue his interpretational path. If we fail to do so, we fall to superstition, forfeiting our divine inheritance. We return to sod and sludge, below even the animals, tumbling to what John Bunyan, the great poet, called the Slough of Despond in Pilgrim's Progress, where he wrote, "This miry slough is such a place as cannot be mended. It is the descent whither the scum and filth that attends conviction for sin doth continually run, and therefore is it called Slough of Despond. For still as the sinner is awakened about his lost condition, there ariseth in his soul many fears, doubts, and discouraging apprehensions, which all of them get together and settle in this place. And that is the reason of the badness of this ground." What intellectual sin caused this sleep of forgetfulness in the sea of ignorance that brings us low? Maimonides here warned against reading his tetradic vision as being merely an account of natural physics and biology. Its purpose was not just to detail natural philosophy's most recent, current explanation of the forces of the universe. Worse yet, we mustn't turn the angelic forces governing nature into physical idols. And he was right to be concerned. Most commentators have seen this chapter to be an account of the elements, like Rabbis Ephodi and Kafih at the very beginning of the interpretive tradition, or more broadly, the elemental forces of nature. Apart from Rabbi Narboni, few commentators recognize Maimonides' vision as our path to transcendence. Maimonides led us to this pass by concealing the fourth angel, the surplus fraction, in his final explanation of the latter angels. And you'll recall he wrote, "The saying of our sages that the angel is the third part of the universe, or in the words of Breshit Rabbah, the angel is a third of the world, is quite clear. We've already explained it in our work, the Mishneh Torah, the whole creation, are the intellects, the spheres, and the material bodies that change all the time. He left out the mysterious fourth third, though he had previously emphasized it. He wrote the four angels that occupied 4/3 of the world. I mean, it clearly impressed him. He mentions it twice. It's the most arresting part of his tetradic vision. The missing fourth third is our active intellect, the image of God, which we inarticulably share with God. In other words, there's no way I can explain how we share our active intellect with God. All we know is that we're made in the image of God. Losing that connection through mere intellectual sloth is the cardinal moral sin against ourselves. And that opens up the moral dimension of how we treat our mind. A soul without knowledge is not good. In commentary on the Mishnah, Maimonides cataloged the parts of the soul, including the imagination. The imagination preserves and stores sense images. It also combines them, sometimes producing fantasies that do not exist in nature. He says, like a man the size of a mountain flying in the air, or an insect the size of an elephant. There are mountains, there are elephants, there are insects, and there are men. But you can't put them together that way. They don't exist. Already in his early work, he scorned the Kalam, which is the Muslim theology, for making the imagination the touchstone for what is real. He wrote, "They thought or made people fancy that everything that can be imagined is possible, despite that the imagination combines things whose existence is impossible. Intellect, by contrast, perceives real-world ideas, pursues sciences, and makes ethical choices." In commentary on the Mishnah, Maimonides makes a powerful moral statement contrasting the imagination and the intellect. He subtly moved to the subject of the active intellect. Know that this single soul, whose powers or parts are described above, including the imagination, is like matter. And the intellect, the active intellect, is its form. What it really, by form he means what it really is. If it does not attain its form, the active intellect, the existence of its capacity to receive this form is for naught and is, as it were, futile. This is the meaning of King Solomon's statement, "Indeed, without knowledge, a soul is not good," from Psalms chapter 19. He means that the existence of a soul that does not attain its form, but is rather a soul without knowledge, is not good. The worst part of a soul not being good, a soul enthralled to the imagination, is that since the imagination only portrays corporeal sense images, it could never imagine the incorporeal God. The idolatry of imaged gods springs from the dark well of the human imagination. A soul without knowledge is not good. We have a moral obligation to awaken to our own intellectual and spiritual life. To thine own self be true. To thine own true self be true. Maimonides wants to rouse us from this darkness of imagination. He exults. This is chapter 73 in the Pinnis translation. How excellent is this speculation, and how great its utility for him who wishes to awake from this dormancy, ha'alta, this darkness. I mean the state of following the imagination. We see that Maimonides used similarly charged admonitory language about image obsession, parallel to the admonition in our chapter. specifically regarding the active intellect. In chapter 6 of the guide, 4 chapters back, the chapter on angelology, he had this to say. It's a longer quote. How bad and injurious is the blindness of ignorance. Say to a person who is believed to belong to the wise men of Israel that the Almighty sends his angel to enter the womb of a woman and to form there the fetus. He'll be satisfied with the account. He'll believe it. He'll even find in it a description of the greatness of God's might and wisdom. Although he believes the angel consists of a burning fire, is as big as a third part of the universe, yet he considers it possible as a divine miracle. But tell him that God gave the seed a formative power which produces and shapes the limbs, and that this power is called angel, or that all forms are the result of the influence of the active intellect, the seichel hapoel, and that the latter is the angel, called the Saru Shel Olam, the prince of the world, frequently mentioned by our sages, and he will turn away, because he cannot comprehend the true greatness and power of creating forces that act in a body without being perceived by our senses. This person, believed to belong to the wise men of Israel, was only wise in his own eyes. He's a sophomore, sophos moros, a sophisticated moron. His thought is shot through with corporeality. He endows divine forces with physical characteristics such as size and heat. He believes that angels have a physical body, occupy space, fly, and are ablaze. He accepts at face value statements like God makes his servants a fiery flame, from Psalms chapter 104, or that the angel is a third part of the universe, never asking whether the fiery flame would consume the pregnant woman or how such a large body could enter her. This wise fool cannot grasp God's greatness as the creator who actualizes vital forces. Maimonides explained to this genius that the force of conception that confers our shape is incorporeal. It cannot be imaged. When he tells him that our natural form comes from a force in our seed actualized by an angel called the prince of the world, which is the active intellect, he flees. He will turn away. Had he told him that this intellect is the 10th level of angels, the Ishim, that he talks about in Mishneh Torah, that is to say, our minds, when they actualize potential knowledge, emanating and realizing form, why, he would run as fast as his legs would carry him. Just to note that the idea that there's a formative force in the male and female seed is Aristotelian. It's called the doctrine of epigenesis. The fool cannot grasp the unimageable angel of the active intellect by which we are in the image of God. As Maimonides warned, in the first paragraph of the first chapter of the guide, some have been of the opinion that by the Hebrew tselem, the shape and figure of a thing is to be understood, and this explanation led men to believe in the corporeality of the divine being, for they thought that the words, "Let us make man in our tselem," implied that God had the form of a human being, i.e., that he had figure and shape, and that consequently he must be corporeal. They adhered faithfully to this view and thought that if they were to relinquish it, they would eo ipso reject the truth of the Bible, and further, if they did not conceive God as having a body possessed of face and limbs similar to their own in appearance, they would have to deny even the existence of God. So they had to read it literally, they thought. And he went on. This is all from the first paragraphs of the Morei Nevukhim. In the phrase, "Let us make man in our tselem," the term tselem signifies the specific form of man, that is, his intellectual perception, and does not refer to his figure or shape. I give you some alternative translations of intellectual perception in the note. Concluding, in the beginning of the guide, man's distinction consists in a property which no other creature on earth possesses, his intellectual perception. in the exercise of which he does not employ his senses, nor move his hand or his foot. This perception has been compared, though only apparently, not in truth, to the divine perception, which requires no corporeal organ. In this account, i.e., on account of the divine intellect with which man has been endowed, he is said to have been made in the form and likeness of the Almighty. Where it says endowed, the term is conjoined, and I explain it in my note. The idea is conjunction with the active intellect, which was a medieval term. Something you wanted to do was to have conjunction with your active intellect in order to realize who you really are, to be true to yourself. On this account, on account of the divine intellect with which man has been endowed or conjoined, he is said to have been made in the form and likeness of the Almighty, but far be it the notion that the Supreme Being is corporeal, having a material form. God stands above Jacob's ladder, which Rambam explained elsewhere means God permanently presides. When we attain conjunction with the active intellect, the Tselem in the image of God, we transcend the world. The angels cannot do this. Rabbi Yehuda Eben Shmuel learns from Maimonides' admonition that we need three things. 1, to arouse ourselves from our soft amnesiac slumber, to recover the wealth of human wisdom. We can do so only by seeking the treasure concealed by the corporeal surfaces of the world. 2, to abandon the notion that blissful ignorance is more comfortable than knowing. And 3, we must aspire to our highest levels as our sages and prophets did. It's a message we must uncover for ourselves. Maimonides bequeathed it to us with his Merkava vision, for he intones that we must note and consider well all we have said. V'lachen haven kol ma shene'amar v'chanechu. Rabbi Eben Shmuel explained, when you come to interpret the riddles of prophecy, follow this pathway, and secrets and allusions will be revealed. Thank you very much for listening. If you like this, please subscribe, sign up for notifications, and like the video. Take a look at all of my content at Maimonides-guide.com. And if you want to contact me, you can at Scott M for Michael, Scott M. Alexander at rcn.com. That's Scott M. Alexander, no spaces, at rcn, RobertCharlesNancy.com. Thank you all for listening. Thank you for your patience.